Hey, welcome to Film Fanatics, three film geeks discussing movies new and old. My name is Dan.
My name is Justin.
And I'm Joe.
This week, our new releases include time-traveling romantic comedy About Time and Daniel Radcliffe in Kill Your Darlings. We also, of course, have our usual triple feature. The new classic this week is The Hunger Games, in anticipation for next week's Catching Fire to hit theaters. Our old classic chosen by Justin is Woody Allen's Sleeper, and our Oscar A to Z continues with the 1934 comedy The Affairs of Cellini. Our top 5 this week, inspired by both Hunger Games and Sleeper, is our top 5 governmental or social dystopian films. Now, before we get started, I meant to mention this at the end of last week's podcast, but last week we had all positive grades for the first time, all three of us, for all of the movies that we reviewed, which is anything above a C+. We have 12 different grades that are possible, and C+ falls right in the middle of there. So we'll have to see if we can continue the streak with tonight. Joe's face is indicating that perhaps that is not the case.
We'll see.
But I guess we'll see. Before we get to the reviews, our news item this week hits upon something I have been up in arms about for years, and that is the MPAA ratings system. Variety magazine reported this week that a new study has found that the level of gun violence in PG-13 films is now outpacing that in R-rated movies. The study examined close to 1,000 movies, including the top 30 box office hits from 1950 to the present. Now, of course, the PG-13 rating wasn't introduced until the mid-'80s, and as a result, the study did find that the use of guns has declined in PG films, but that it hasn't changed largely in R-rated movies, but continues to rise considerably in films that are PG-13. It's always been my contention that, among other things that I find wrong with the system, the violence is treated much more leniently than sex or language. I was appalled when I realized both the Taken films, which are horribly violent, had a PG-13 rating, yet our top movie in our new releases this week, About Time, literally says the F word only 3 times and has a couple of scenes with very light sex and innuendos and gets an R. Joe, what are your thoughts on the rating system in general, I guess, and specifically their violent content?
Well, even listening to you give that description, I honestly thought you were going to say that About Time was PG-13. I honestly didn't know what the rating was, but now hearing you say that was R just because of a few curse words, which I barely noticed, that's just ridiculous.
Isn't it the worst?
Like, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. I don't understand these standards, and I've always kind of thought that the MPAA was kind of questionable in their decisions. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I do agree that I think that violence is kind of allowed to slide, even though I think that you could argue it's just as bad, if not worse, than some sexual themes. Mm-hmm. I don't know, honestly. And language seems to be something that they've always gone up and down about. I think the rating system has a lot of problems.
Yeah, and you go back to the 80s when they were still, I guess, trying to figure out what PG-13 meant. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of PG movies that say F and have boobs in them. And
as far as I know, none of those movies really caused a lot of controversy.
Right.
Like, I don't remember many that did, and apparently viewers went to see them with their kids and it didn't destroy their lives.
Yeah, exactly.
No correlation I know of.
Justin?
I think it's largely a product of the overall country that it's being run in.
True.
Obviously, in our nation, violence is not necessarily a big deal, but sex is, and that's probably the main reason why About Time got rated R. In contrast, there are other countries where violence is in fact a very big deal, and other things like sex or language is kind of a lesser point.
Yeah, a lot of countries have a pretty lax policy on nudity and stuff like that, even just on their TV shows.
I think that's primarily just a reflection of the culture, and that might be what you said we're going with the MPAA rating. And since America has a big history with violence, we're kind of lax about gun laws, things like that. Maybe it is something that's a little lighter in those particular areas.
Yeah, that's not to say I'm justifying that we're toning it down. I'm just saying that's sort of a product of what we are. Honestly, the findings didn't surprise me that much. I think the main thing that PG-13 has been making a lot of use of over the years is you can get a PG-13 in movies and have gunplay in it, but as long as it's bloodless, it's fine. But if it's like gory, like The Expendables or something like that, it's instantly R-rated because of that, regardless of if it's realistic or not realistic. I think that's why we're seeing so many more guns in PG-13 films and a lot more subtle use, if not significantly less, in R-rated films.
I actually think that there is another element here that I'm not sure always comes into play, but I think one reason, and I hope they use this sometimes, that might rate certain films R over PG-13, I think you meant kind of going with action films. A lot of it has to do with context. I mean, if something's really over the top and has action, like, I don't know if you remember the film Mafia, if either of you ever saw that, there was a lot of really silly...
The comedy movie.
The comedy
with Christina
film.
Applegate.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
It's basically parodying like Casino, Goodfellas, all these mafia movies, and there's a lot of violence in there, but it's really over the top and silly. That might be PG-13, whereas something that has more serious tone, like, say, Prisoners, would get an R rating. So, I think that might be one of the reasons they kind of go in looking at it. They do try to go by context, but I'm not sure that always plays.
Well, and horror is another genre that I have an issue with, because there's a lot of movies that are really, really, I think, horrifying, like Insidious, The Ring, and they are PG-13 whatever the reason is. I'm not sure.
That might be because, once again, the context. I think because there's a lot of fantasy elements and science fiction elements in some of those films, some people might not take that as seriously, and since that's kind of separated from reality, they might go a little bit easier on the ratings, unless the violence is really intense.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. There's a film called This Film Is Not Yet Rated that I would highly recommend. I believe it's on Netflix Instant, because I think that's how I watched it a couple years ago. But it's a really interesting look into the rating system and who are the people that actually rate the movies.
Is that the documentary?
It is a documentary, yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend it to any of our listeners that are at all interested in, why the ratings in the U.S. are the way that they are. But, all right, we'll move on from that. I could talk all day about how terrible the rating system is. First, though, we're going to talk about our new releases, About Time. And that's first on the menu, and Joe's going to tell us about that.
Well, About Time is an interesting film from the director of such British comedies as Four Weddings and a Funeral and Notting Hill, one of my personal favorites. And it follows a young man who, he's coming through a crossroads in his life, kind of a coming-of-age story. He hits the age of 21, and his father reveals to him a big secret, and that is that he can travel back in time, primarily to moments in his own life up until the point in which some of his children are born, at which he can't go any further back from that particular point. And, as you might imagine, there's a lot of hijinks, but the primary message that his father gives him is that he has to use this gift to try and make his life as good as he can. His primary focus is love, and this leads him to finding the perfect woman for him, played by Rachel McAdams, who's done such similar films as The Time Traveler's Wife and The Notebook. Basically kind of goes from there, and it's a fairly upbeat film. To be perfectly honest, I went into this movie and I didn't think I was going to like it that much. Mostly because I didn't know who the director was. The moment I found that out, I realized, I might give this a chance. I really liked the general concept of this movie because I think it's something everyone can relate to. Everybody wants to go back in time and wonders if they could relive certain moments, right mistakes, but that's not what the primary point of the movie is. It does kind of say it rather heavy-handedly towards the end of the film. You kind of have to make the best with what you have. And I really like that. It's a very positive film. It's fairly lighthearted and enjoyable, but it does have some slightly heavier moments. I liked the characters. I thought they were relatively well written, especially the main character. The actor gave a fairly good performance. The dialogue was pretty good. I thought that there was a lot of chemistry between the two leads. I liked some of the side characters, though. I do feel that some of them were a little underdeveloped, but I'm not really sure that was a huge problem because the primary focus was on one individual. Mm-hmm. But on the whole, the comedy was pretty good. The plot was decent. I do like the fact that the time travel did have some limits, and it kind of made things a little more intense. The only real negative I had with the film was I thought that it didn't feel to me like there was a huge enough conflict. Like, everything just kind of felt like a series of events that just kind of kept on going, which might have been going along with the theme of the film, but the couple in the film never really seems to have any major struggle between them, and I didn't think that was very realistic. And considering many other elements of the film were rather good in exploring relationships, I thought that for them to pretty much have a seamless love, that basically be perfect for each other, perhaps too perfect for each other, was a little unbelievable and just seemed too easy. However, there were some genuinely touching moments in this film, and I got a little teary-eyed towards the end. I'm not going to give it away, but it did touch me, it was enjoyable, and it did pretty well with its hook. Not the most original film I've ever seen, but definitely better than some that have tried to do similar things, and I'm going to give About Time a B+.
Yeah, it's definitely more than just a romantic comedy, because you've got the father-son thing, the time travel stuff, and then, of course, the love story hooks it together. Mm-hmm. Rachel McAdams, as you mentioned, is sort of getting a name for herself now with a ton of these romance films.
But Dan, I actually liked her in this.
Well, my point actually about that is going to be that whether the films are good or bad, she's always likable.
Mm-hmm.
She's always charming and cute and all of that. As luck would have it, this is one of the better of the films that she's done in this sort of vein. But as Tim, Domhnall Gleeson, however, is new not only to the romantic scene, but barring turns as a Weasley brother in 2 of the Harry Potter movies, is kind of new to the big-budget film scene in general. As awkward as Hugh Grant, but not quite as classically handsome, Gleeson helps to make About Time a bit of a winner. It's no surprise why he's using the Hugh Grant playbook, though, because as you mentioned, writer-director Richard Curtis also wrote many of the films in the Hugh Grant romantic comedy filmography.
Oh, Dan, it's kind of interesting you bring that up, because I really did feel they picked an actor that was really going for that, and you could tell that if Hugh Grant was a little younger, he would be sitting in this spot.
And a ginger.
And I mentioned that to Justin, yes.
Yeah.
This is a younger, ginger version of Hugh Grant.
It really is taken just right out of...
It's like, you can really see his style, his formula, but it's still good. Still good.
Oh, I think it definitely works. What makes About Time stand out, though, other than all of that, is the B story between Tim and his father, played by Bill Nighy. It adds a sweet undertone that normally you don't really see in romance movies. It reminded me a little bit of Big Fish in some ways.
It's definitely something that more romance movies can need, a good subplot.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I thought most of the time travel stuff was wasted, because the bulk of the movie really was about the romance and about the father-son. The time travel thing was a nice hook, a nice twist.
That's all it was.
But that is all it kind of was.
But honestly, I thought it worked. It wasn't supposed to be this big exploitative gimmick. It wasn't supposed to be like caked in CGI. It was just sort of like meant to get from A to B.
I agree. I thought that it did work fairly well. But
I'm not saying it didn't work. I'm just saying it wasn't really utilized all that much.
So you think people might be misdirected?
Yeah, I mean, all the previews was basically about the time travel and a little bit about the romance, a smidge about the father-son stuff.
It's a plot device.
Yes, it is.
And it works.
It does work. My issue with it, though, is that the details of the specific time travel in this movie are a little bit murky, and it causes a number of plot holes throughout the movie. For example, in the beginning, when his father is telling him the different rules of the time travel, he says, only the men in the family can time travel. Yet at one point in the film, Tim holds his sister's hand and they time travel together.
It's interesting you bring that out, but the truth of the matter is I kind of figured that maybe his father never tried that.
That's possible.
I mean, it could be a plot hole, but I don't think it was quite grounded enough to say for sure that it definitely was.
Well, there are some other plot holes that I really can't get into. That was sort of my non-spoiler plot hole.
Okay.
But, I mean, getting bogged down in that stuff is kind of irrelevant.
True.
Because the truth is, it's a feel-good movie. It defeats the purpose to sort of nitpick that kind of stuff. Yeah. But overall, I did enjoy About Time, and I give it a B.
I was actually curious, going back to your plot hole about the sister. How'd you feel about her character?
Well, I felt she was fine, because she was one of the more important characters to his life. The character that I didn't really feel needed to be there was the sister's friend.
Oh, his first love, so to speak.
Yeah, the first love.
Yeah.
I mean, she sort of created a couple of comedic moments when he was trying to figure out how to time travel.
That's debatable.
But, I mean, if you're going to ask me which character could have been excised from the movie, it would be her.
I actually really liked the sister character.
Yeah, I was fine with the sister.
She was probably one of my favorite side characters in the movie. I kind of wish they had focused a little more on her plot when they brought it up, because I thought she was a little underused.
No, I did too. When they finally gave her something to do, I was kind of thinking, let's take this even further.
Let's explore it.
Because that was actually the closest the movie got to a real good dramatic conflict. Even though it didn't directly affect the couple, I still thought it was one of the stronger points of the movie.
Anyways, let me get to my review, I guess. The introduction of time travel to the romantic comedy genre may seem kind of silly, but in the case of About Time, for the most part, it works. This is really due to, as I put it earlier when Dan was giving his review, to subtlety and really clever editing that allows the audience to put together where and how something may be altered in the film instead of relying on these somewhat tacky CGI gimmicks, which could have been really easy for them to fall behind. The cast plays their parts to satisfaction, keeping it lively, funny, and even a little bit dramatic, as Joe put near the end, and as we talked about with his sister. But it never really goes in a direction that most people that are familiar with romantic comedies haven't seen before. As a result, it sometimes drags on in some aspects of the film, just slightly too long. One of the moments that stuck out to me the most was this really, really cheesy romantic montage with this indie rock group playing in a subway, and it just drags.
Yeah, that was weird.
I kept thinking, okay, we get it, they're in love, let's get to the next thing. But all that said, for romantic comedies this year, it may very well be the best of the bunch, and on that account, I give it a B.
Yeah, I mean, there's only really so much people can do with romantic comedies, so, for you to say that there's nothing really new, certainly the time travel element is very new. I think the father-son relationship is sort of not a new twist, but it's something that you don't see in a lot of romantic comedies.
I think it's one of the more unique and fairly well-written romantic comedies I've seen in a long time.
Yeah.
So I think it stands out quite a bit.
Our next movie is The Best Man Holiday. Now, this is the sequel to 1999's The Best Man, and it stars Taye Diggs, Terrence Howard, Nia Long, and Regina Hall, among others, reprising their roles. This time, the gang gets together at football star Lance Sullivan, played by Morris Chestnut, and his wife Mia, Monica Calhoun's house. Sparks start flying almost immediately as Harper, played by Diggs, has been estranged to Lance for years due to something that came up in the original Best Man film, that Harper had been with Mia in college sexually. However, author Harper has been long looking for his next hit book and wants to plot a comeback with an autobiography of Lance. You throw in a few other relationship issues, secrets discovered, and bad blood between some of the other characters, and their holiday weekend becomes much more lively than any of them anticipated. Now, none of us had seen the original Best Man film, though the friend that I went with filled me in whenever something would come up that I didn't really understand. But even not being armed with the knowledge, it is a fairly enjoyable film, and it truly rises above recent African-American comedy baggage claim, not to mention anything in the last 5 years by Tyler Perry. Writer-director Malcolm D. Lee is not known for highbrow films, helming things like Undercover Brother and Scary Movie 5. However, he recruited his cousin, Spike Lee, to serve as producer, like he did with the original Best Man, and that does seem to make the difference. It's fairly well written and decently acted. Best Man Holiday, though a little early in the season for a Christmas movie, does well in its comedic moments, and even though its emotional scenes are way too heavy-handed, I have to admit they did get to me, and I cried by the end. It's not all great, though. Most of the best lines go to Terrence Howard, who I seem to like less and less with each passing year, so that was a little bit of a bummer for me. And some of the side stories I didn't really care much about. The other thing is, all of these people are so ridiculously beautiful and well off. I found myself not being able to relate to too much with any of them. However, that being said, I will take unrelatable over poorly written anytime, and I give Best Man Holiday a C+. Justin?
Okay, so whenever a sequel that takes a long time to come out does actually get to theaters, I've come to the conclusion that there can only really be one of two outcomes. It's a complete and utter waste of time, or it's just decent. The Best Man Holiday is the latter. Admittedly, like Dan, this is my first time with the characters, but it took almost the entire first act to find anything redeemable about these people, which really makes it a slump for the most part. That said, this does improve as the film goes on, offering a couple surprisingly decent chuckles later on in the film. Although The Best Man Holiday falls prey to a couple poorly timed transitions from drama to humor, and vice versa, and runs on entirely too long, there's no question that for the right crowd, this will be well worth a watch, but for everyone else, that's just not it. The Best Man Holiday gets a C.
Joe, what do you think of it?
This movie was a very mixed bag for me. I'll start off by saying it was better than I thought it was going to be. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it more than I thought it was going to be. I thought this was honestly going to be a bad, if not terrible, movie.
Well, especially after baggage claim, because the previews made it look pretty much like the same. Like the previews for both movies were very similar.
It looked like a very similar type of movie. But I liked most of the cast. The actors and actresses that I was familiar with, I was happy for them. I actually thought that it was enjoyable seeing them, and most of them give pretty good performances. Mm-hmm. Some of the dialogue was pretty well written, and I thought the plot was fairly decent. I was intrigued with some of the characters, and I kind of want to see where things going. However, at the beginning of the film, probably for most of the first act, I found most of the characters very unlikable, and it really just kind of had to progress to the point where they got more likable as the film went on. So I did start to care a little more by the end, but at the beginning it was rough for me. The other big issue I had with it was the fact that I felt that the comedy and the drama didn't quite well sync. Like sometimes they would have a a really, really dramatic moment, and then like 2 seconds later there would be a joke to kind of undercut it, and it either would seem like the drama wasn't something you could take too seriously, or the joke just wasn't that funny. And I thought that the timing could have been better for that. That was the biggest problem I had with it. However, when it worked, it actually did make me laugh quite a bit. On the whole, I think it was a slightly above average film for me, and I'm going to give Best Man Holiday a C+. I thought Terrence Howard's character probably was the funniest.
He stole the show, really.
Which I'm not a huge fan of him, but he probably had some of the funniest lines delivered. And I think, as Justin put, I think with the right crowd, especially if you've seen the first movie, this probably would get a higher grade. I don't think that it's a bad film. I said to Justin that could probably be in the B range, but for me, with my experience with it, it didn't quite make the cut.
Well, it's interesting that what Lee did is at the very beginning of the film, he sort of showed scenes from the original Best Man to sort of remind everybody, and then he sort of showed like, oh, here's what they're up to now. Except if you didn't see the first film, it was like meaningless.
That's actually one thing I'm glad you brought up. I thought that was going to set the tone for the entire movie,
right.
And it was like a really, really cheesy montage with like animated flowers and CGI, and it was really overdone. And I was not happy about that. The first like few minutes of the film left me even more confused and just bewildered. And I thought if that was like the rest of the movie, I would have hated it. So I'm glad that that did not stick.
I was okay with how it was done. I just wish it would have actually given us a little more, because the original Best Man was not a runaway blockbuster hit. I mean, obviously, in the black community, it's a little more on the radar than for us. Was
the first movie more of a comedy or a drama?
I think it was about the same.
Because I just wasn't entirely sure this film knew what it wanted to be. Because it was marketed as a comedy, but I felt like it had a lot of dramatic moments. So I thought that there were two conflicting ideas on what the film should be, and I kind of wish it had picked one.
Right.
Personally.
All right, we're going to move on to our next film, and that is Kill Your Darlings. Justin?
Okay, so a young Allen Ginsberg, played by Daniel Radcliffe of Harry Potter fame, heads off to Columbia University where he encounters rebellious poet Lucian Carr, played by Dane DeHaan. As the two get closer, Ginsberg encounters fellow poet Jack Kerouac, played by Jack Huston, and begin to form the rebellious Beat Generation. The best and worst thing about Kill Your Darlings stems from the fact that it goes out of its way to find interesting ways to tell its story. Some of which work, like the use of intercuts that change the meaning of a given scene. Others just seem there only with the purpose of being experimental and possibly even a little bit flashy. Regardless of either intent, the storyline is by far the most interesting aspect of the film, and how it unfolds never tires. While DeHaan and Huston seem to be fully embracing the nature of their iconic writers, Radcliffe, at least personally, doesn't seem to be as in touch with Ginsberg at the start, and that sort of flip-flops throughout the film. While the film pays a great deal of attention to the main three, it often leaves the rest of the ensemble by the wayside, with little or nothing to do. Notably, Elizabeth Olsen as Kerouac's then-wife, Edie Parker. Kill Your Darlings will not be for everyone, but for those willing to give it a chance, there may be something interesting to look at. Kill Your Darlings gets a B-.
Yeah, Elizabeth Olsen was completely wasted. I mean, she had a couple of lines, but anybody could have played that. It wasn't like...
And there were so many other ways they could have made her more interesting and useful.
I agree. I've complained on the show before about period pieces and movies that take place before 1900, but one of my favorite eras is the 1940s and 50s. This movie starts in 1943, and it is a visual treat with meticulous care taken with the set design and clothing and characterizations of the people that started the beat movement of the 50s. Originally with Radcliffe having to film the last two Harry Potter movies, he was replaced in the film originally with Chris Evans and then Jesse Eisenberg, neither of who I think would have done a particularly good job. I actually don't agree that Daniel Radcliffe did not do a great job here. I thought he really made Ginsberg come to life, and his American accent is flawless.
Impeccable.
Which you certainly can't say this is the same for fellow Harry Potter alum Emma Watson. With a hint of stubble on his face and messy hair, he does a great job of really transforming himself into somebody else. And also Dane DeHaan from Chronicle and Metallica Through the Never is a great match for Radcliffe. They have good chemistry together, and he also turns in a great performance. Unfortunately, though, the look and those performances, and like Justin said, the plot on the whole, are the best of what Kill Your Darlings has to offer. I think it believes that it's smarter than it actually is. The plot does tend to meander a bit, and the soundtrack and score are a bit of a mystery. especially with a scene of Ginsberg tripping. There's music playing that you'd hear in a club today, and just some of the score choices didn't mesh with what the scene was doing. But overall, like Justin, it is a positive for Kill Your Darlings slightly, and I give it as well a B-.
Did anybody howl in the movie?
Nobody howled in the movie, but they did. I think the closing line said something about howl.
Yeah. Okay, well, I was like, you can't do an Allen Ginsberg movie without somebody quoting at least the beginning.
Yeah, and this is actually the second Ginsberg portrayal I've seen, because there was a movie a couple of years ago called Howl with James Franco.
That was a decent film
in the lead role, and it wasn't bad. I think I gave it around the same, like a B, B-.
It's an interesting character. That's good.
Yeah, he definitely is. Unfortunately, Joe did not get to see that movie, but hopefully at some point on DVD or
I'll check it out.
Redbox, you can check it out there.
Definitely.
Speaking of which, we now move into our home media moment. This is a movie that we did not get to review on the show that has recently come out on home media outlets, and this is The Internship this week. I did see this one in the theater, but we weren't actually doing a podcast yet, so we're going to really review it for the first time here, and Justin and Joe got to see it for the first time this week. Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson team up again, this time as Billy and Nick, who instead of crashing weddings, find themselves laid off from their sales jobs, and they score internships with Google. They are fish out of water completely, and forming a team with the other outcasts of the program, they must compete in various challenges against other teams to see who eventually lands a job with Google after it's all over. Now, I have to say, my expectations were not too high for this film. I like Vaughn enough, though he gets tiresome, and Owen Wilson hasn't had a great track record lately with broad types of comedy like this. But I have to say I enjoyed The Internship more than I thought I would. True, the comedy is very scattershot, and what does work isn't necessarily knee-slappingly funny, but the chemistry between the two leads is undeniable, and the message of togetherness and teamwork, I thought, did not come off as cheesy or sappy. I originally gave this film a B when I saw it in theaters, maybe partially due to liking it much more than expected, but I do have to say, after a reflection, the commercialism of it all, namely that the film is largely a 2-hour Google commercial, does kind of bother me. So in retrospect, I am going to leave The Internship with a C+. Joe?
I actually really like Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson together. I think they were a pretty good comedic duo back with Wedding Crashers. So I was kind of expecting something along the lines of that film, and I don't think that it's as good as its predecessor in that sense. I do agree with what you said, though. Their chemistry is undeniable.
Yeah.
I mean, they're
really great together.
They're a good comedic team, and I wish they had found a better movie.
I would agree with that.
Honestly, so I do hope you guys keep making more movies. They're pretty good. And I also agree that the message of togetherness wasn't too cheesy, and I thought that it was kind of a decent reflection on times, people getting older, more out of touch with technology.
Yeah.
A little extreme, perhaps, but I did think it was a relevant message. Other than that, though, yes, the rampant commercialism of all. I mean, and plus some of it was just kind of insulting and downright dumb. There was a scene where I think Vince Vaughn's character said it best when they're doing their internship, and one of the challenges is a Quidditch match. And he's like, what does this have to do with computers? And I completely agreed. I thought that it was completely outlandish. And the fact that you should consider, what if not everybody that works at Google necessarily likes Harry Potter? I mean, they didn't take that into consideration. That was just incredibly dumb to me, for instance. And there was a couple pop culture references, I think it was in the trailer, they go find Professor X when they send him on a prank and they get punched by a guy in a wheelchair. I didn't find that funny. And I find it hard to believe that two guys who might not necessarily know a lot about computers or the internet don't know anything at all about the X-Men.
Never heard of the X-Men.
With it being a major movie franchise for the past decade or more. Just some things like that didn't work for me. However, there were some subtle moments. I actually think, though, and I watched this with my girlfriend, and she actually pointed out a couple interesting things. Owen Wilson has some good lines in the movie. Not necessarily funny ones, but very poignant ones. Usually when he's trying to romance the one leading lady. He has some good lines. And Vince Vaughn, I always like. So, on the whole, though, I think it was very uneven. It's not their best, but it wasn't a horrible movie. It's kind of smack dab in the middle for me. I'm going to leave The Internship at the C.
I will speak to the Quidditch thing. That is something that is very popular on college campuses these days. So I can see Google doing something to that effect.
Believe me, I know. I know that some colleges actually do have Quidditch teams, but I just still think that to make that a main focus for an internship at a company was a little outlandish, especially even with the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
That just really stuck out to me for some reason.
I just took it as sort of a team building exercise, teamwork exercise.
I guess, but it was just I didn't quite work for me.
But I will say, you bring up a good point with the X-Men bit. There are certain times in this movie where they seem just unbelievably stupid.
Like there is a point, I think, when they were going through the Skype interview where it was implied they didn't even have computers.
Right.
They're like, that's why they were in the library. I'm like, you can't really exist even as a salesman, in the 21st century without some kind of PC or Mac. It's just, I thought that was incredibly unbelievable. So there were parts of that. Those are the worst things of the film, were the unbelievability. But the more down to earth stuff was the strongest point. As it was in Wedding Crashers.
Yeah.
But Wedding Crashers was funnier and better timed and honestly just better written. So.
Yeah. And Justin, the resident Vince Vaughn hater of the group.
No, Vince Vaughn.
Joe and I, not hater, but
not hater, just not the number one fan.
Yeah, let's say not his number one fan.
He's not that bad.
I think that's a fair way of phrasing it. I like some of his earlier stuff, but here we go. There have been countless films that have been marred by over-product placement over the years, but The Internship takes that to an entirely new level. It's literally defined by Google product placement, and it certainly doesn't help that the two comedic leads, Vaughn and Wilson, who I personally think are a little bit overrated as a buddy team, are well past their prime for a role like this. Instead of adding fun to the story, director Sean Levy seems to think the best way of getting the audience to laugh is to make both of them talk very fast for long periods of time about literally nothing. Needless to say, it doesn't work at all. However, what does work, slightly, is the supporting cast that makes up their team in the film and the antics that happen with them. I can't say their efforts saved the film, but it does keep The Internship from being a complete and utter disaster, and I will leave it with a D.
I thought you were going to go maybe a little bit higher. I know you don't like Vince Vaughn.
Honestly, I don't think it was a god-awful film.
I think D is too harsh.
It might be a below-average comedy, but I've seen far worse attempts at it.
The commercialism, the completely inane babbling from Vince Vaughn, which, can somebody please tell him that doesn't work? He's been doing it for like the past 3 movies, and it falls flat every single time.
That is one thing about Vince Vaughn I don't really care for.
Yeah,
I will admit that you're correct on that.
He needs to slow down a little bit.
But I do think he's funny. I don't think you think he's funny at all.
Well, do you prefer his dramatic performances, Justin? I mean,
oh my gosh, no.
Well, then, so you do think he has some comedic talent?
Okay, I didn't see The Cell, which is like the one other one.
I have seen The Cell. I thought he was actually decent in that.
I wouldn't say I don't think he's funny. I think he's essentially forcing the same shtick down the audience throats over and over and over again. And it worked well when he had it more focused and defined, like in Dodgeball. Mm-hmm. But in recent films like The Watch last year and The Internship this year, it's just becoming, oh, look, Vince Vaughn can talk really fast about mediocre 80s references.
I noticed that we were focusing more on Vince Vaughn, but what do you guys think about Owen Wilson?
I think Owen Wilson is okay. I think he actually does better when he's in less comedic roles. For example, in Marley and Me or in Midnight in Paris. I think that when he tries too hard with the comedy, a good example might be the Night at the Museum films.
Okay.
Of all of the portrayals in the Night at the Museum films, he's not one of my favorites.
Okay, but I still think he's not terrible at Night at the Museum.
No, he's not, and I love the original Night at the Museum. I absolutely love. It's an A movie.
He's no
for
Robin
me.
Williams, but
he's no Robin Williams.
Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting you said. Have either of you ever seen Minus Man?
No,
because that's an earlier performance by him where he was a dramatic performance and he played a serial killer that was trying not to be one. Okay. I thought he gave a decent performance. The guy has some.
Let me paraphrase Justin here with his bit about Brad Pitt. I think Owen Wilson is actually better as a supporting player.
Okay.
In the Meet the Parents movies, I think he's very funny.
Small doses.
For example. Small doses. Because I find him to be like a bit of a whiner.
He probably is better as a supporting character. However, I do feel that he can carry a movie when he's partnered with somebody like Vince Vaughn.
I agree. I think the best company he has is either Ben Stiller or Vince Vaughn.
Between the two of them, definitely.
Yes.
I think he's good, but Owen Wilson works best when he has somebody that knows how to use him. The main example I think of is when me and Dan first started hanging out and the movie Moonrise Kingdom came out. Mm-hmm. He told me about this movie called Darjeeling Limited, and
He's so good in that movie.
He is.
You're right.
And I didn't even think he was going to be good because at the time it was like, okay, this is Owen Wilson. He talks in this nasally voice. He does the same thing over and over again, sort of like Vince Vaughn.
But not necessarily.
But in this, he did a really good job. I'm sort of surprised.
So, I honestly think that like these guys get better acting chops than I think people think they do. Do you like them as a team? I don't really know.
Not particularly, to be honest with you. I mean, to be fair, I saw Wedding Crashers when I was probably way too young to actually appreciate it.
Okay.
So eventually I probably will get around to giving it another go, even though there's one scene in that movie that truly, truly, truly bothers me.
I think I know what it is, but...
More than likely you do.
I think I do.
Admittedly, this is only their second outing, so maybe they're going to get back to form later.
Well, this is their second outing as starring duo role. Vince Vaughn was in Starsky and Hutch also.
That's true.
He wasn't the lead like Ben Stiller and Owen Wilson, but they did pair up in that as well.
Good point.
And obviously, I mean, they're friends in real life. They're part of that whole, they call it the frat pack with Will Ferrell and Ben Stiller and all of that.
I think that their comedy does work together, and they know each other well enough.
I think so, too.
So I think it works.
All right, well, enough talk about the internship. Let's move on to our top 5. And this week, it's a little bit of more specific topic. It is dystopian movies, but more specifically, governmental and social dystopian movies. This was based on that we saw both The Hunger Games and Sleeper this week, both of which employ a governmental dystopia. And we had over 100 choices to pick from. We took specifically from Wikipedia's list of films with governmental or social dystopias, just so we were all on the same page. Recent examples from just this year include Elysium, Oblivion, and The Purge. But Justin, what exactly is a dystopia, just in a general sense?
Dystopia is essentially this society that is kind of frightening, dark in nature, very unpleasant, and is meant to sort of inflict suffering or misery and make life difficult upon its inhabitants.
And usually, I guess it's kind of a reflection on some societal issues that are going on when the film was made.
Such as like totalitarian governments and things like that.
Exactly. Usually it's a comment on something getting out of hand in the future.
Right. So with that in mind, why don't we kick off our top 5? And Joe is going to tell us about 5 through 2 on his list.
5 through 2 it is. All right, number 5. You guys could probably guess what this is, because I talk about it all the time. My number 5 is RoboCop. This film, admittedly, I guess you could say the primary focus is not the dystopian nature of it, but there's a lot of good snippets that really capture the atmosphere of the film and kind of shows what the characters are going through, primarily through the commercials, which are really ridiculous, and just kind of showing how commercialism of the 80s just basically took control of the future and just gets to the heart of everything, and basically comparing that with the crime that's running rampant in Detroit. I think it really, really works well for setting the good hero of Murphy transformation to RoboCop and rediscovering his humanity again. My number 4 is a sci-fi classic that I've also mentioned before. It's Logan's Run. Kind of follows a lot of traditional themes. Basically, far off in the future, humanity is suppressed, living in these giant domes. However, nobody lives beyond the age of 30, in which they all go into a gathering place and float around and get shot by a giant laser. But nobody questions it because it's great to be young, until one man, who has to pursue someone who escaped, finds out that the system is somewhat flawed and realizes that there is more to life beyond the dome. Number 3 is very similar to the previous one, and that is George Lucas's first film, THX 1138. I would argue possibly his best. Robert Duvall plays a man who lives in a society where emotions are suppressed, but once again, after deciding to not take some of his medications, finds that there is once more something beyond his underground caverns, and after defying various superiors, including robotic henchmen who are some of the most terrifying beings I've ever seen in a dystopian film due to their lack of emotion and, well, their strange cruelty, his journey to freedom is really quite uplifting, and it's really an awesome film to behold, I think, and it's quite an awesome directorial debut. It's kind of sad that George Lucas didn't continue beyond Star Wars and show that he had a lot more variety. And my number 2 is a great comedy, kind of commenting on certain issues going on in our society, and that would be a Mike Judge film known as Idiocracy. I think
finally one that I've seen.
It's a lot of sci-fi.
Yeah.
Luke Wilson really steals the show in this film, and it really does have a lot of poignant messages that I think we can all take a lesson from, and the comedy really works, and it's just so over the top. It's one of Mike Judge's best, I think, and that would be my number 2.
Awesome. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I had a great debate about my number 5. I wasn't sure, because Idiocracy is definitely, like, on the short list. I had, like, 7 choices that I was like, these are contenders. Mm-hmm. And I decided to leave Idiocracy off just because I don't think it's quite as good as my number 5 as a film. Mm-hmm. But it's rare to see a comedic dystopia, which we'll talk about a little bit later with Sleeper. Mm. But Idiocracy is one of the only other examples I can think of, and it is a great movie.
It is.
For those that have not seen Idiocracy, definitely check that out. My number 5 is a movie called Children of Men.
Good one.
And this came out a few years ago. And this is when I was just sort of really spreading my wings, movie-watching wise. And I think, maybe in high school or college, this isn't a movie that I ever would have sought out. But I'm glad that I did. Children of Men takes place in a world where women can no longer get pregnant, and all of a sudden, about 17, 18 years in, one does, and it's sort of a quest to find her to safety, find this, child to safety, to continue with society now that they've discovered people can get pregnant again. It's a very, very intense movie. My number 4, which we will go into more detail with later, is The Hunger Games. Don't need to say too much about that now. We're going to review it in full in just a few minutes. My number 3 is The Matrix. Now, this is a movie I have not seen in about a decade, and it is one that I'd like to go back to. I've seen at least twice, maybe 3 times, but the last time I saw it was right before the third one came out. And once the trilogy was complete, I never really went back to it. And the second and third movies, I don't think I probably would watch again. But the original Matrix is fantastic. It was completely groundbreaking at the time. Keanu Reeves, as we've talked about on the show, is not one of my favorites, but he's great in the movie, as is, of course, Lawrence Fishburne. He is great in everything. But just between the special effects and the storyline, and just even the quotability. My number 2 is The Dark Knight. Now, this is probably my favorite of all the films on the list, but I would consider its dystopian nature a little bit less than some of the other ones on the list. I mean, it is, but it's more a crime-fighting movie, a superhero movie, so I just sort of leave it at number 2 with that.
I think it kind of goes off from the theme of the list in terms of the technicalities, but at its basis, Gotham in the film is presented as basically being a society which has really gone downhill and incredibly corrupt, and one man had to fight against that, which does, on a basic level, kind of follow those themes. So it's fine. And if you enjoyed that film in those parameters more than any others, then it's fine.
Okay.
I do think it's maybe not the primary focus.
It's a little. That's why I couldn't put it at number 1 just because of that.
Yeah, the dystopian nature's there, but it's really not.
It's loose.
It's loose. So that's my number 2, The Dark Knight. Justin?
All right. So before I go through with mine, I want to talk a little bit about my criteria that went into this. I essentially put it into 3 main aspects. First being how well the film's narrative actually fits the description. The second being how thoroughly it explores the dystopian nature of the film. And the third being, of course, my personal enjoyment. So here we go. Number 5 is Battle Royale, as these two...
Wow, I thought that was going to be number 1.
narrowly missed my list. The reason I didn't put it on mine is I personally felt that the dystopian nature of it wasn't as important as the struggle the characters went through. I saw it as more of a character piece.
It's an interesting point.
But continue with your point.
Yeah. So Battle Royale is a film all about essentially suffering and punishment, and viewers see that throughout this vicious tournament to the death set over only a few days. The characters are essentially being punished due to low school attendance rates and have absolutely no say in whether or not they choose to fight. As a result, some play, some try to resist, and others just merely try to find the quickest way out. However, in Battle Royale, the majority of what is known about the outside world happens within pretty much the start of the movie, which is about 2 minutes long, if that. During which, following that, it becomes difficult to tell if the outside world is as miserable and as difficult and as painful as the world within it. Among the films in this list, Battle Royale is probably my favorite, but because we are looking at these films in terms of dystopias, I can't put it much higher than my number 5. Number 4 is Never Let Me Go. There are a few times I will refer to a movie as soul-sucking, in a positive way, but Never Let Me Go would be that necessary exception. The protagonists in this film were literally born to give their lives to others, and their constant efforts to try and prevent that fate. However, it does not really go much further than what the protagonists are able to do within that society, because in the film they have limits as to how far they can go into the outside world. But based on the unsettling and depressing picture that this film paints to the audience, I have absolutely no issue making Never Let Me Go my number 4. My number 3 is Strange Days. Now, this was a collaborative effort from Catherine Bigelow and then-husband James Cameron, and because of that, I really find it surprising that Strange Days doesn't get more talked about around film groups. James Cameron wrote the script for this one about a world heavily influenced by virtual reality through a type of video streaming, a theme that I would argue is still very impactful today. And director Catherine Bigelow really does a good job of bringing that vision to life. That said, it doesn't always work. It does go off in a couple really strange directions. They decide to throw in a governmental conspiracy theory around the second act that seems a little bit out there. But for the most part, it's still a really underappreciated sci-fi film, well deserving of being number 3 on this list.
I'm glad you brought that movie up, because up until 30 seconds ago, I forgot about its existence entirely. I remember when the commercials were out, and I was like, oh, I want to see that. And then, like you say, it's not talked about. I mean, I haven't thought about that movie in probably 7-8 years.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
But that is one I want to check out, so I'm actually really glad you put that on your list.
On to my number 2, which is Sleeper. Now, much like Dan with the Hunger Games, I'm not going to talk too much about this one, so I'll keep my reasoning for this one pretty brief. Sleeper's environment is hilariously twisted and nonsensical, and still manages to provide even a little bit of social commentary. Sleeper may be a bit too goofy at times for some, but for me, it's not only one of my favorite comedies, but a movie well worth taking the runner-up slot for my top 5 dystopian films.
Joe, what about your number 1?
My number 1 dystopian film of the societal variety would be Gattaca. I think this is both probably one of Ethan Hawke's and one of Uma Thurman's best performances. I really like this film because it really does focus on the concept of genetic tampering and how that can really divide people into different classes, and really in a way of trying to basically accentuate human potential, it could very much limit it. And I will admit that this is primarily the background of the story, and it really is just one man's journey. But I think that really is the core of basically all these dystopian films, is one man kind of looking at society and basically trying to break free from it to do the best he can and really just kind of rediscover the true aspects of his humanity. And I think that's really what this film does really, really well. And I think since that's at the heart of all these types of films, of all of them, I think Gattaca really leaves me with one of the best impressions. It's an excellent movie, and I really would recommend it to anyone who has not seen it before.
I have not.
Really?
And I'm an Ethan Hawke fan.
Well, honestly, it is my favorite movie of his, and it's a pretty decent sci-fi film, and I think most importantly, it really is a good film about one man's journey to kind of fight against society's expectations, and it's really got some great acting and some really great cinematography.
Nice. I will check
Not
it
to
out.
mention a killer score.
Killer score. I mean, in terms of presentation, it really, really is seamless. I think it needs to get more respect. I mean, I know people, when they remember Gattaca, they remember, oh, that was a really good movie, but I think it needs to be, better known.
Nice.
Yeah, you'll be happy to know that, much like Battle Royale for you, Gattaca just narrowly escaped my list.
And I'm glad it narrowly escaped it.
Well, my number 1 is a very recent film, probably the most recent that we've talked about here in the top 5, and that is Looper. This was in my top 5 last year, 2012. It's Bruce Willis and Joseph Gordon-Levitt playing a young Bruce Willis, and the dystopian aspects are there. The action is there. It was, I thought, just a really, really well done movie, and I think deserving of my number 1 on the list. Now, that being said, I have only seen it once. Most of these other movies I've seen multiple times, so it would be interesting to maybe in a couple years revisit Looper and see if it would still be tops of the list. But from, I remember just walking out of that movie just blown away by how good it was.
The movie definitely has some strong aspects to it. I thought some of the interesting twists of the plot were good, and it does have some great shots and some good performances.
It's pretty original.
It's pretty original, especially kind of in tying it in with organized crime. I kind of like that element. I think some things weren't quite as seamless, though. I'm not sure if the film has as much staying power for me as it did with some people, but it is a good film. It's a good number 1 choice.
Justin?
All right, my number 1 is Fritz Lang's 1927 classic, Metropolis. I was a bit reluctant to put this on the list, given that I've only seen a very edited 75-minute cut of the film, but even from that, I would still stand on my belief that this would be number one. Not only do the viewers see a problematic dystopia, they see it from the dual perspective of the working class and of the all-too-privileged upper class. It's a timeless class conflict, and as a dystopia, it does not hold back on the hardships of the workers, even for a movie from the 1920s. It may come off as slightly preachy at times, maybe even more so at the end, but Metropolis is a classic dystopian sci-fi in the very essence of the word that has inspired great films in the genre, and still continues to do so, and because of that, it serves as my number one.
You know, it's really quite a good setting point, I think, for it, because in terms of dystopian films, it really did set the bar, and it's pretty haunting for a film that of that time, I'd say, and it really is actually probably one of those holds up the best.
All right, good top five, guys.
And to you, sir.
And thank you. Now, before we move on to our triple feature, I will point out that it's very windy outside. Not sure if that's picking up on the mic or not, but...
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. All right, let's get now to our triple feature. We've got our new classic, which is The Hunger Games, our old classic, which Justin just sort of told us about briefly in his top five. That's Woody Allen's Sleeper. And our Oscar A to Z, which is the comedy from the 30s, The Affairs of Cellini. First, though, is a film I mentioned in my top five of the dystopian films, and that is The Hunger Games. Joe is going to tell us about that.
Hunger Games is based on the recent teenage fantasy series.
Sure.
And
I think they qualify it as young adult, but I think fantasy is probably more correct.
I think it kind of fits in that particular vein, but basically it kind of fits with the realm of the dystopian films we've been talking about, and it's set in a society that recently had a terrible civil wars, and basically the government has divided the nation into various different districts, and to keep them under control, they select the young from each of these districts to fight in a competition so that the winner can give their particular district food for the season. And the main character, played by Jennifer Lawrence, is Katniss, who, through a basic sacrifice, shall we say, takes the place of somebody else to represent her faction, and while playing the game, actually becomes part of a much bigger political movement which could change the face of her society. I have to say that this vein kind of follows Battle Royale, and I'm not sure it does it quite as well. On the whole, there is some good cinematography in the film. There's good costuming. I like some of the set designs. I think the performances are good. You've got some veterans like Stanley Tucci and Donald Sutherland, some of my favorites. They really kind of bring some credit to this film. Woody Harrelson actually does a pretty good job. And Jennifer Lawrence, I think, does decent in the main role. The story is relatively solid throughout most of it. I feel like the characters are somewhat underdeveloped in this film. I think it might be because I didn't read the book. I think they managed to capture some aspects of what these characters are going through mostly good performances, but I kind of felt like the ending was a bit rushed, and I've heard that there were differences from the novel. I honestly don't know. Overall, I enjoyed the film primarily due to the presentation and the performances, and once again, I do really think it had some good costuming and set design, and I liked the story, but I feel like there are films that have done this before but have done it much better, so maybe I was looking at it from a different perspective. On the whole, though, I found Hunger Games to be entertaining, and I would give it a B+.
All right, well, this is one of my favorites from last year. I did read the book, and it is one of my favorite fiction books of the last few years, and the movie became a staple in my top 10 last year. This is the first time that I actually ever read a book that I wasn't assigned for school and immediately saw the film. And I think both have many merits to them. Some of the things that the film changed from the book I liked a lot, and obviously the book gives you an insight into Katniss' psyche that you can't really get from the movie, since thankfully director and co-writer Gary Ross decided not to employ voiceovers. But since this is a film podcast and not one for books, I need to just review the film and leave it at that. Now, I'm a Jennifer Lawrence fan from seeing Winter's Bone even before she was nominated for it, so I think she was a perfect choice for Katniss, and it's really one of these defining roles that will stick with her for the rest of her life. Now, smartly, at the same time, she's branching out in all directions. Obviously, she just won an Oscar for Silver Linings Playbook earlier this year, so as not to get pigeonholed down the road. But make no mistake, like Robert Downey Jr. and Tony Stark, she is Katniss, and I don't think anybody her age could do a better job with this kind of a role. And I will say one final thing about the book, though. I also had a unique perspective with it that readers from when it first was released didn't have, because I read it after the movie had been filmed, so I was able to, as I was reading, sort of see the characters as the actors portraying them. But even still, I think the casting is pretty spot on. Woody Harrelson turns in a fantastic performance as the comedic relief in the film, but still a major player in the plot. Donald Sutherland, like you said, he's the president of Pan Am, the name of their society, and all of its district. He's perfectly heartless here. Great job with the role. And so on and so forth. The only negative I can really say about the film version of The Hunger Games is that there's a scene in the middle in which Katniss gets bitten by these deadly wasp hybrids called tracker jackers that cause her to hallucinate. And the entire scene is pretty clumsy, but especially the part that's supposed to explain how Katniss's father died. It makes completely no sense if you haven't read the book, and to be honest, I don't think it needed to be addressed at all. They sort of briefly touched on it in the beginning of the movie. It's sort of unnecessary as a plot point. I also don't really love the love triangle between Katniss, her special friend back in District 12, Gale, played by Liam Hemsworth, and her male counterpart in the games, Peeta, played by Josh Hutcherson. But largely, I really, really do love The Hunger Games. I am about 2/3 of the way through Catching Fire, the book, thanks to Justin for the loan on that. So I'm going to do the same thing with Catching Fire, finish the book, and head into the cinema to check it out. Hopefully, I find it to be as engaging as I thought the first movie was, and I give Hunger Games an A. Justin?
Well, I'm glad you went first on the positive review.
Yeah, I thought that might be a better way to set it up. Me first, and then the damage,
and then the more critical review.
I gave it a fairly positive review.
Yes, I enjoyed your B+. Thank you.
It wasn't too bad.
All right, so here we go. When it comes to any adaptation, one has to figure out what will translate to screen well and what will not. This is something that director Gary Ross, who directed Pleasantville, and I still consider an incredibly strange choice to direct this film, does not take into consideration with The Hunger Games, and the overall product suffers from it constantly with cheesy CGI, the campy overall look of the film, and sets that resemble a 70s science fiction film. Instead, Ross seems much more focused on attempting to secure a PG-13 rating, by making all of his scenes have nauseating shaky cam, which is a pity because they're about as brutal as they need to be, but it's almost impossible to see them, for essentially no reason, and toning some of the darker aspects of the source material down. I don't necessarily think that it had to be covered through voiceover like Dan mentioned, but
that would have been ridiculous.
It would have been, but yeah. I don't think it would have required voiceover. However, despite these flaws, the actors, as much like Dan, I am also a big Jennifer Lawrence fan. I thought Woody Harrelson brought it home, and even the biggest surprise for me was Lenny Kravitz. Katniss's...
I know, Lenny Kravitz was great as Cinna, which is Katniss's stylist.
There we go.
You know Lenny Kravitz, the singer, Joe.
That was Lenny Kravitz?
Yeah.
That was Lenny Kravitz.
He was also in The Butler. Did you see him in The Butler?
Yeah, he was pretty memorable, actually.
Yeah, the man can act.
He can, and
somehow.
That completely surprised me. Yeah. With musicians turned actors, it's kind of a win or lose, but
yeah.
He's definitely a win. And all these actors do really well in bringing the source material to life and keeping the audience engaged despite the rather long running time. As a result, the film, similar to my take on the novel, does well with what it has, but honestly, I kept feeling like it had the potential to be so much better, and I hope we get to see that with The Hunger Games Catching Fire. So for me, The Hunger Games scrapes by with a B.
What I think is interesting, though, is you don't seem to actually like the book all that much either. It seems to me like you would probably rate the book about a B range as well, right?
Both of them have their strengths and weaknesses. I think there are some things that the book did very, very well, and there are some things I think the book did not do so well. Joe, you mentioned that the ending felt rushed. Yeah. I absolutely loathed the ending from the book. The ending of the book was an incoherent nightmare.
So would you guys say you actually enjoyed the ending to the film over the book?
I would happily accept the cliffhanger that they gave for the movie over the completely nonsensical ending that they placed in the book for audiences.
What about you, Dan?
I don't dislike the ending of the book anywhere near as much as Justin. I thought it was okay, but I do prefer the ending to the movie, yes.
Justin, I know Dan mentioned this. I don't know if what did you feel about the love triangle in the movie or the book? Because I personally found that to probably be the the weakest part of the movie
for me.
It
was one of the weaker ones, yeah.
Because the primary characters that I was supposed to care about, I felt, like I said, were a bit underdeveloped, and I'm not sure it was executed as well as it could have been. Well, I think the side characters really held the movie up for me.
It's an adaptation of a young adult book, so it's going to happen.
It's unavoidable, but you could still do it all right.
I also think Liam Hemsworth is a lousy actor.
I didn't really like him that much in the role.
He wasn't good in Paranoia. He was sort of just there in Hunger Games.
No.
It's not so much that I think he's bad. I think it's just the matter that his character is... And this is just going completely out on the first one, so if there's any Hunger Games fans listening to this, understand this is completely independent of...
Yeah, you haven't even read the second or the third book.
That's correct. So, but I'm intentionally trying to go blind with the upcoming Catching Fire because I want to see if that would actually impact my review. Mm-hmm. But my problem is, and this is, like I said, just going off of the first movie, Gale is an incredibly weak character. He's literally just this random, heavy-handed, tough guy. Honestly, when I was watching him in the movie, I kept drawing parallels to Tom Cruise in Legend.
Basically, someone who just doesn't really have that much interesting going for him. He's just there. He's the pretty boy.
Yeah.
That's all he's got.
That's not to say that Pete is much better. It's just we get a little bit more backstory, even though they put in these really, really weird 15-second intercuts that are supposed to give you the majority of the backstory for PETA, which would have been great if they had actually spent some time on it, but they don't.
Yeah, it was a little more fleshed out in the book, for sure.
It definitely was.
Yeah.
And that was one of the book's stronger suits, and then everything comes apart in the third act.
No, to be honest, I do wonder if I would have enjoyed the movie as much if I didn't read the book. Because I had all this background that they don't necessarily give you in the movie. And I don't think it's like, the difference between Best Man and Best Man Holiday when I don't know what's going on. I mean, I still knew what was going on. But I feel like knowing what was in Katniss's mind, because the book is taken from her perspective, so it's all
that
her
is
thoughts.
Definitely an advantage of appreciating the movies more when you have read the book. And I have to say that, for instance, with the Harry Potter films, I loved the books. I knew the characters before the movies, so I was able to appreciate some things that people who just watched the movies might not have enjoyed them as much because... However, oftentimes I find that since the book is usually better, I'm surprised that you weren't as critical of it because normally... The book is usually better because they have more detail.
Right.
And so most people are somewhat disappointed by the film.
Well, because here's the thing. I think they did a great job with it. We talked last week about The Descendants. I enjoyed the book as I did the movie. Now, in that case, I had seen the movie several times before I read the book. But I do wonder if, not only if you hadn't read the book, Justin, but also if you didn't have such an attachment to the similar Battle Royale.
Honestly, I don't really think that it's there. For example, when I first heard about Hunger Games, yes, it was in terms of Battle Royale, and I did invest in the books to see the similarities and differences, but I really did view it as an independent entity, not necessarily trying to rip it off, not necessarily being a copy of it. Suzanne Collins said in an interview that she had not even heard of Battle Royale until the first book had even been published. And as far as I'm aware, she still has not even read it. And I totally believe her.
So they're not, super, super similar.
In background context, no, but the general concept of the film, yes.
Okay. Of the battle itself, like the game.
The battle itself is basically the same.
Okay.
Just handled very differently. When I looked at it, I, of course, viewed it independently as well. But I guess looking at it because I think Battle Royale is an excellent film, the thing about Battle Royale is it didn't hold back. Whereas Hunger Games has to be a little more mainstream and accessible, so everything's toned down, which I think makes the film a little bit weaker. But then again, it does have a different goal, different audience.
Right.
It's not supposed to be quite as intense.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way that they would have released Hunger Games with an R rating. If that, dampens Justin's view of it, then that is...
It may have been a better film, though.
Maybe.
Which will always be heavily debated, but...
I think it was as bloody as it needed to be, and as we learned at the top of the show, there's certain violence aspects that sort of get a little bit more of a pass in a PG movie. Not that there were a lot of guns in Hunger Games, but there's a lot of sword play and arrows and whatnot.
I have to say I was somewhat disappointed, though, because when I watched the Hunger Games, it didn't make me that hungry.
No?
Not really. I'm telling you.
Well, on that comedy note, let's move into our comedy, and that is our old classic of the week. Justin brought us Woody Allen's 1973 movie, Sleeper.
Yes, please tell us about Sleeper, Justin.
Miles Monroe, played by Woody Allen, also the director of the film, wakes up 200 years after unintentionally being cryogenically frozen, and learns that due to not yet being identified, he has been recruited by the rebels to investigate a mysterious conspiracy known as the Ares Project. While being pursued as a fugitive, he disguises himself as a butler in a socialite's home named Luna, played by Diane Keaton, whom he kidnaps and accidentally ends up serving as his accomplice as he delves deeper into the dystopian society. Now, what I really like about this is completely out of Woody Allen's normal range from his romantic comedies, Annie Hall, or other things along those lines. Allen took his directorial palette into the realm of science fiction and managed to fuse his own brand of humor into the genre extremely well. But alongside this genre, he invites several other subsets into it, such as silent film-style slapstick, which was part of the reason I actually wanted to run this. It may be a bit too bizarre for the modern crowd, something I constantly worried about when I decided to show this for Dan and Joe, but Sleeper is a film that takes a number of risks that largely pay off, and I have to admire it for that. Sleeper, for all its bizarre comic hilarity, gets an A from me.
Yeah, prior to this, the oldest Woody Allen movie I had ever seen was from the early 90s, so I missed his entire heyday. I am definitely looking forward to seeing Annie Hall in a couple of months for our Oscar A to Z, but I am glad that you brought this one, Justin. Like Idiocracy, like we mentioned earlier, it's one of the very few examples of a comedic look at a dystopian society. Some of the humor is a little dated, and while I'm sure this had them rolling in the aisles in '73 with its then topical political humor about Richard Nixon, etc., and social ridicule, certain parts of it do seem a bit stale today. But what is timeless is Allen's physical comedy, like Justin mentioned, the slapstick humor of the film, and really the overall plot. I think Allen wrote a comedy masterpiece here, and though I'm sure I didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I would have 40 years ago, I can see how it is indeed so highly regarded by film critics everywhere. And as an aside, Diane Keaton is fantastic. Sleeper gets from me an A-.
I'm not too familiar with Woody Allen's work. I've seen some of it, and overall I have mixed feelings about it. One of the things I really liked about this film was probably the science fiction aspect and just the dystopian aspect overall, and the fact that it was parodying a lot of those themes that we discussed in dystopian films. And I really enjoyed that. That was funny. Woody Allen knows his films, and to see him really branch out beyond his normal range was definitely a good thing. And some of the dialogue was really witty, and I did like the fact that alongside the parody, there was some good political, social, and philosophical commentary. However, beyond that, I think a lot of the slapstick and the bizarre elements of the film were just very hit or miss. Some things I thought were somewhat funny, some things I found kind of bizarre, and sometimes I was kind of bored. But this film does try a lot, and that definitely makes it memorable and worth watching. On the whole, though, I kind of felt like the plot, while intriguing, felt more like a string of vignettes that weren't quite as well connected as they could have been. I would have to give Sleeper a B-.
This is what we decided earlier that day as was going to be my gutsy move to run something that people weren't expecting, and I'm not quite sure I won everybody over. Joe, definitely not, but
I would have definitely expected it if you told me you were running a comedy. Because I constantly tell you that I think you're too hard on comedy, and your retort is always, well, I gave Sleeper an A. But yes, Joe?
Well, I really did like Woody Allen in the movie. I thought he was funny. And I thought Diane Keaton was great. I just didn't find it as engaging throughout. I thought certain parts of it were really good. Like, for instance, it starts off kind of with this really great sci-fi setting, and I loved that. But it just didn't keep up with it the whole time. It was very hit or miss for me. So it's a positive review, Justin. I just think that it's definitely something that is very limited to different people's tastes. And I think that's because it tries to do so many things. And it could get a higher rating from other people, as it did, but just for me, it didn't quite work.
Yeah, I think I tried to sort of put myself in the shoes of a 1973 filmgoer and seeing this, for the first time. Just like I sort of try to do with our Oscar nominee movies, try and think of how would I have viewed this back then. And I do think he was certainly trying something, like Justin said, out of his normal wheelhouse. Mm-hmm. And some of the humor is certainly a bit stale for today's audiences. But I do think that the homage to silent films and that kind of thing was probably pretty refreshing, for filmgoers back then.
I kind of felt like this movie was really kind of really, really overblown with Woody Allen's ego. And I guess that just bothered me. I don't know. He just kind of likes to make himself the center of the film. And I don't know. Something about it just seemed a little pretentious, I guess.
Oh, I getcha.
And I think that might have bugged me a little bit.
And to contrast to some of his other films, like, yes, I do get what you're saying. But with some of his other things, Annie Hall was one that really speaks out to me in that way. This is tame in comparison, but...
I do agree with you, Joe. And I think that's sort of the divider with Woody Allen people.
In all respect, I think that he was aware of that, and that's cool, but I just don't know if I could quite get around it.
Yeah. All right, well, we have one final movie to talk about, and that is our Oscar A to Z movie this week, and that is The Affairs of Cellini. Now, much like last week's movie, The Adventures of Robin Hood, Cellini was nominated at the 1934 Oscars for a few technical awards, including Best Art Direction and Best Cinematography, although unlike Adventures of Robin Hood, it did not win. But the reason it's in the A to Z is for Frank Morgan, the Wizard of Oz himself, and his nomination here for Best Actor. He plays Alessandro, the Duke of Florence, in the 1600s, who is married to the Duchess of Florence, Constance Bennett, and they both have a bit of a roving eye. The Duchess currently has her eye on Benvenuto Cellini, played by two-time Oscar winner Friedrich March, who was hired by the palace to make gold plates, which starts a rivalry between Cellini and the Duke. However, the Duke is kind of oblivious, causing some funny situations. Fay Wray, star of King Kong one year before, also stars as one of the Duke's women on the side. This movie is a quick 80 minutes, and is another movie like one of our recent Oscar nominees, Adam's Rib, in its ahead-of-its-time brazenness about sex. There's a couple jokes specifically in the movie that might make you blush even now if you saw this movie with your mother. Even though Friedrich March got top billing, likely due to his character's name being in the title, and because he already had won one Best Actor Oscar, it's easy to see why Morgan was nominated in the top acting category that year over him. He steals the show completely. Basically, take the scene in Wizard of Oz when he's discovered behind the curtain and can't quite find the words to explain it, stammering and stuttering all over the place, and that's his entire character in Cellini. But for this lighthearted farce, I thought it worked, and I give it a B. Joe?
I think the greatest thing about this film is how short it is, so it knows that it has a limited time to work with, and so therefore a lot of the comedy is quick, but it's smart and it's funny, and some of it's really ahead of its time, particularly the scene with the sheep had us all laughing. It seemed like something from the 90s, like scary movie, like, I don't know what these guys were doing during the filming, but it was pretty unique. Other than that, I have to say that I tend to like historical films, and I think that it kind of did touch upon the society of the time a little bit, and played with some of the nobility, and some of the performances, particularly the lead. I mean, he cracks me up. He was just really, really good. It was a strong comedy, and I actually admit I was not really looking forward to this one, but I was pleasantly surprised. I thought it was really, really good. It was fun, and I have to admit that if you haven't heard of this one, go check it out. Find it if you can.
Yeah, we had to actually get it from YouTube and burn it onto a DVD to watch it because I could not find it on VHS or DVD.
It's a
very
shame.
Easily.
It's a shame that it's so unknown. I had never heard of this film before, but it's really, really fun, and I think that if you like older films or even newer ones, you'll be able to appreciate it because it's kind of witty and even a little risque for an older film.
Oh, yeah.
I would say that The Affairs of Cellini gets an A-.
Wow, nice, Joe. Justin?
The Affairs of Cellini has the benefit of understanding its stage origins and utilizing it to the best of its abilities throughout the film. Frank Morgan, who is nominated for Best Actor, really does give a hilariously entertaining performance as the Duke of Florence. It may not be as captivating or quotable as his later role as the Wizard of Oz, but he does keep a slightly predictable narrative from ever getting slow. The rest of the ensemble adds great wit on top of this, particularly Friedrich March, who probably has the funniest scene in the entire movie, as we talked about a couple moments ago, with a sheep, and I swear we're not making this up.
It's so out of place, but so amazing.
Overall, The Affairs of Cellini may not be one of the greatest Oscar nominees, but it did make for one really enjoyable watch, and I give it a B as well.
Yeah, and for Wizard of Oz fans, I mean, you know, as you may know, it's my favorite movie ever. I think it's interesting to see some of the actors from that movie in different roles, especially starring roles, you know, in a movie like this, and he truly steals the show.
There was also one thing I noticed during the film. There was a scene, kind of a balcony sort of thing. There was actually a lot of good stunt work, I thought, for such an older film. That's one thing that stood out for me, too.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, there was a really cool pan of him going up the wall, and if it wasn't a stunt double, it looked exactly like him.
Yeah.
And if the actor did his own stunts, more power to him. But it was really, really cool, and you don't see much of that kind of action-oriented stunt in such an older film.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I can see why it was up for some of those technical awards, like the cinematography and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Costumes weren't bad either.
Yeah, I agree. All right, well, good way to wrap up the show with a positive review. Not all positives this week like last week, but...
Well, you had to make them watch the Internship,
Yeah, sorry about that.
We'll get it next time.
Well, next week we will have our review of the Hunger Games' second movie, Catching Fire, among other things, of course. And you can check out Joe's YouTube page. Did you do an extended Thor review on there?
Yes, I did. I did an extended review of Thor: The Dark World, and just kind of going a little further into some of those points that I made in the podcast, but I let some of my rage flow, and I also talked about some more anime and stuff, so check it out.
And that's Merlin the Mighty on YouTube.
That's correct.
Or you can, there's a link just right at the bottom of this page here. And, of course, you can join us on Facebook at Film Fanatics with an exclamation point. And, of course, our Twitter is up as well, and that is at Film Fanatics Pod. And we'll see you back here next week. Thanks so much for listening. Bye!